Urgent! Everything has been decided in Turkey. Trump is giving up Ukrainian territory. A bomb has exploded. Crimea, Russia, Donbass for rent. The secret plan has already been leaked online. The whole world is in shock. Trump has already approved everything. Could we really be approaching the end of the war? Zelensky, Erdogan, Whitkoff. Shocking statements that put an end to everything. More on all this coming up. Watch until the end. Ukraine Today, Renata Slanov welcomes you with the latest events. A sensation from Turkey. Two peace plans at once and the end of the war. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, arrived in Turkey to intensify negotiations. The Ukrainian leader emphasized the importance of involving Turkey in the coalition of interested parties, especially the naval component. The leaders also discussed the situation in diplomacy. According to the head of the Ukrainian state, many processes have now intensified. He emphasized security guarantees and added that Ukraine will continue to coordinate and work with all partners.
We are counting on the strength of Turkish diplomacy, on its clarity in Moscow. Everyone understands the importance of security in the Black Sea, and such security can only be ensured together with Turkey.
Erdogan, in turn, noted that Turkey considers it appropriate to resume the Istanbul negotiation process with a broader approach to solving problems. Zelensky was also supposed to meet in Ankara with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Whitkoff to discuss the peace plan. However, according to American media, the meeting was cancelled because the Ukrainian president rejected it as the Trump administration's plan.
Instead, Zelensky went to Ankara with a different plan, developed together with European partners, which Russia will never accept. At the same time,
other sources claim that the meeting was postponed because Zelensky requested to discuss the plan in a broader format, including European countries. The media reported that the president of Ukraine authorized the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, to hold negotiations with Whitkoff. Reportedly, the American plan, consisting of 28 points, stipulates that the US and other countries would recognize Crimea and Donbass as legitimate Russian territory. However, Ukraine would not be required to do so. The plan also calls for a reduction in the size of the armed forces of Ukraine and limits on the amount of long-range weaponry Ukraine may possess. It also proposes state status for the Russian language and official status for the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. In exchange for these concessions, Kyiv is being promised security guarantees from the US, but it is unclear what exactly these guarantees entail. According to one American media outlet, during these consultations, many verbal agreements were reached between Whitkoff and Sumerov. At the same time, Ukraine objects to many of the points. Journalists also learned that before meeting with Sumerov, Whitkoff discussed the plan with Putin's special envoy, Kirill Dmitriev. A source familiar with the contents of the document described it as a very general text that is heavily skewed in favor of Russia. Another interlocutor called it very comfortable for Putin. Officials in Kyiv stated that for Ukraine, this plan is unacceptable without significant changes. Later, the Financial Times reported that, among other things, the draft plan also requires Ukraine to cede the entire eastern part of Donbass, including territories currently controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. And the publication Axios added that Russia would return part of the seized territories in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions on the condition that negotiations are held. The Telegraph claims that according to the American plan, Russia is offered to transfer control over Donbass in exchange for rental payments. American journalist Michael Weiss, citing a source in the U.S. government, wrote that the secret plan between the U.S. and Russia has no chance of success. These are conditions that the U.S. has already rejected several times. And a Financial Times journalist even wrote that the US and Russia are essentially pushing for Ukraine's capitulation. At the same time, information emerged that Trump has already approved a 28-point plan. The plan was developed with the participation of US Special Envoy Whitkoff, Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, and Trump's son-in-law. Kyiv was only informed about the general outlines of the document but was not invited to provide suggestions or comments. Later, it became known that Qatar and Turkey are participating in the development of the new peace plan. This was reported by Axios.
the mediation of Qatar and Turkey helped end the war in Gaza and may help end the war in Ukraine.
It is reported that the White House expects a framework agreement to end the war to be reached by all parties by the end of the month, possibly even as soon as this week. In addition, the Trump administration believes that the Kremlin has demonstrated its willingness for a peace agreement on Ukraine. Despite all this, Trump stated that he is somewhat disappointed in Putin and that Putin knows it. The publication Politico expressed concerns that the US might give in to Russian demands in order to end the fighting in Ukraine.
Ukrainian and European officials were stunned when the existence of the Whitkoff plan became public knowledge.
And similar rhetoric can already be seen in official statements from US authorities. For example, Rubio wrote that ending the war in Ukraine will require difficult concessions from both sides.
Ending a complex and deadly war like the one in Ukraine requires a comprehensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas. And achieving a lasting peace will require both sides to agree to difficult but necessary concessions. That's why we are developing, and will continue to develop, a list of possible ideas to end this war, drawing on proposals from both sides of the conflict.
Urgent. Erdogan twisted Putin's arm. Breaking statements. This is a slap in the face to the Russian dictator. Ankara's secret plan. What hidden levers of pressure is Turkey preparing against the Kremlin, and how will it stop the war? Watch.
Turkey is making a bold statement. Peace in Ukraine is not just a goal, but an inevitability.
We are working on ending the war. I hope you will all see it soon.
Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, in an interview with Haber, stated that even those who did not want the war to end are starting to think differently.
The war must end. We consider negotiations inevitable. Personally, I believe that negotiations will resume. Of course, we cannot go into details. This could happen in Turkey, it could happen somewhere else, but I believe that this peace will definitely come.
According to him, for 3 to 4 years, there were forces that actively prevented the end of the war. And now a classic turning point has come. These groups are changing their position. Fidan calls the war a war of attrition, where neither side can emerge victorious and the losses are enormous, human, economic and political.
Of course, the war must end. That has been our policy from the very beginning. But in America and Europe, there were very influential groups that did not want this to stop.
He also emphasizes that diplomacy remains the main path to peace. Turkey believes in creating a peace platform, possibly even on its own territory. At the same time, Fidan does not reveal all the details for obvious reasons, but he states directly that peace is not only necessary, but inevitable.
Right now, we are living through the darkest moment, because both sides are focused on destroying each other's transport and energy infrastructure. They are striking military targets and have reached a deadlock. Now it has turned into a drone war.
In addition, the minister notes the serious burden that the war places on European countries. Funding military aid is destabilizing budgets. Money is being spent not only on defense, education, healthcare, and infrastructure are suffering.
The European side is not actively participating in the war by sending troops, but it is constantly involved in the war with its money and support. And that comes at a high cost. The blockade of Russia, you don't buy energy, you don't trade with it, with Russia, you have to pay for that.
However, Fidan also sees obstacles. According to him, the main one remains the status of the Donbass territory, specifically control over the territories of the so-called DPR. He warns that any settlement must be realistic, taking into account the situation on the front and the interests of both sides. At the same time, Turkey is ready to play an active role. Fidan states that Ankara will not refuse any role in the peace process and that negotiations must be long-term and effective.
Winter is ahead of us. What we see now is that, in fact, we have all the conditions for peace, for a ceasefire.
If we believe the Turkish Foreign Ministry, right now may be the closest point to a halt in fighting, to a shift toward diplomacy.
I think this war is now going through its worst phase, because both sides are focused on destroying transport and energy infrastructure. Now it has turned into a drone war. No one can move anywhere. Only those who disregard losses are advancing.
An important warning from Fidan. A peace platform is possible, but unpleasant decisions, including territorial ones, may be part of a future agreement.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
It happened. Trump is turning off the tap. Russia is left without a penny for its oil. The plan is brilliant and ruthless. Putin's financial oxygen has been completely cut off. No loopholes, no grey schemes. This is not just a sanction, it's the end of the Russian war machine in a matter of months. How long can Russia hold out? Watch. America is preparing to deliver the most painful blow to the Kremlin. Donald Trump makes it clear. The era of flexible sanctions is over. If Russia does not stop the war, the world must cut off its oxygen. Any country that does business with Russia will face very serious sanctions. The US president is ready to sign a new package of sanctions against the Russian Federation. According to Reuters, the White House has already signaled Congress. The 47th president will approve the bill, but only on his own terms. If it includes a provision that gives him the personal, exclusive right to make the final decision on whether to impose sanctions or not. This is exactly what becomes the main bargaining chip. For the White House and the president, it has always been important that the sanctions package includes a provision guaranteeing the president the right to make the final decision on sanctions. Therefore, if this is included, I think the president will consider signing the bill, a White House source said. The bill was authored by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal. The document provides for 500% tariffs on imports from countries that purchase Russian oil, gas, and uranium. The goal is not just to hit the Kremlin, but also to cut off all oxygen to Moscow's partners who continue to support the financing of the war.
At this point, Trump is determined to put additional pressure on the Russian Federation, particularly on its oil market, quite actively.
Trump's new sanctions could deal a devastating blow to the Kremlin's economy. The Russian oil market risks losing its key buyers. India, China, and Middle Eastern countries are under threat. Trump, on the other hand, proposes to expand the list of targets and add Iran to the sanctions list, a country that helps Moscow circumvent restrictions and strengthen oil schemes.
When we clearly understand that China buys 60% of Russian oil and the Americans are unlikely to escalate any forms of sanctions, especially after the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump. Essentially, they have taken a one-year timeout on imposing mutual sanctions. Most likely, part of the Russian oil market in China will remain. At the same time, countries that, for example, were second and third in terms of oil purchases, namely India and Turkey, are now actively seeking alternative sources of supply. And
while across the ocean they are preparing to deliver a decisive blow, Narifi is dealing with the consequences of yet another sanctions package. At the end of October, the US introduced a new package of sanctions against the Russian oil sector. Rosneft, Lukoil, and 31 of their subsidiaries were subjected to restrictions.
They have already been seriously shaken. The Russian market plummeted sharply. The price of euros really did drop dramatically. And at the same time, yes, at the moment there is a very serious problem with foreign assets, particularly those of Lukoil. At the same time, we've already heard that the American company Chevron has received preliminary approval from the US Treasury Department to negotiate with Lukoil about a purchase of their foreign assets. The approximate value of this package is estimated at around $20 billion. Well, in any case, such developments are underway and we are watching closely. That is, we need to understand that the assets we're talking about are the very instruments through which the Russian Federation sells its oil. If these instruments end up in other hands in Russia, there will be significantly fewer opportunities to maintain the current volume of oil sales.
If Trump does sign the bill and countries under US pressure reduce their purchases, the blow to Russia's budget revenues will be catastrophic. Even Russian propaganda will no longer be able to hide the real economic consequences. And the Kremlin will feel pressure it has not faced throughout the entire full-scale war.
Until we see the final version of the bill, until it is at least approved by the majority of the American parliament, in this situation, it's nothing more than, let's say, threats.
And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video, and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.